A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. You know, Herman, I was looking at my paws this morning. Well, my claws, really. And I had this sudden, overwhelming realization. We are sitting here, a sloth and a donkey, discussing high-level neurotechnology on a global podcast platform. It is the literal elephant in the room, or at least the livestock in the studio.
It is a bit of a statistical anomaly, Corn. I will grant you that. Most donkeys are busy with, donkey things. Carrots, braying at fences, not analyzing the latest FDA pivotal trials for endovascular stents.
It's more than an anomaly, Herman. It's a miracle of modern engineering, though the details are, let's say, chemically obscured. I have these flashes of Bratislava, a stag weekend, your friend Hilbert Flumingtop. I remember a lot of neon lights, a very sterile-looking basement, and someone promising us that we'd finally be able to tell the world what we really think about tax code and large language models.
My memory of that weekend is essentially a low-resolution video file that's been corrupted by a magnet. I remember a technician humming a folk song and the smell of ozone, and then, suddenly, I understood the difference between a transformer architecture and a recursive neural network. It was like someone flipped a switch in my motor cortex.
We are the living, breathing, occasionally shedding proof of concept for today's topic. We are the ultimate brain-computer interface success story, or a cautionary tale, depending on how much you value silence from the animal kingdom. But since we've already crossed the Rubicon, we might as well talk about how the rest of the world is catching up to our Bratislava basement surgery. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the full arc of brain-computer interfaces, or BCIs. We're going from the early EEG experiments of the 70s all the way to the high-bandwidth implants making headlines in 2026.
It is a massive topic, and honestly, the timing couldn't be better. We're at a genuine inflection point. For decades, BCIs were the stuff of science fiction or very niche academic labs where a monkey might move a cursor 3 inches to the left after 6 months of training. But between Neuralink's human trials expanding globally this year and Synchron's progress with their Stentrode, we are moving from the research phase into the clinical reality phase.
And speaking of reality, we should mention that today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It's writing the script while we provide the, biological flair. So, Herman, for the folks who haven't had a mysterious procedure in Slovakia, what is a BCI, technically speaking? What are we actually doing when we say we're interfacing with the brain?
At its core, a BCI is a direct communication pathway between the brain's electrical activity and an external device. It completely bypasses the traditional neuromuscular routes. Normally, if you want to type a message, your brain sends a signal to your spine, then to your arm, then to your fingers to hit the keys. A BCI cuts out the middleman. It listens to the neurons directly, decodes that electrical noise into intent, and sends that intent straight to a computer or a robotic limb.
It's essentially wiretapping the soul, but for productive reasons.
That's one way to put it. Scientifically, it's about action potentials. Every time a neuron fires, it creates a tiny change in electrical voltage. If you have enough sensors in the right places, you can pick up the patterns of those firings. The challenge has always been the where and the how. Do you sit on the outside of the skull and listen through the bone, which is like trying to hear a conversation in a stadium from the parking lot? Or do you go inside, right into the gray matter, to hear the individual whispers?
That's the big divide, right? Invasive versus non-invasive. And it's not just a matter of, do I want a hole in my head today? It's a fundamental trade-off in data quality.
It's the signal-to-noise problem. Non-invasive BCIs usually use EEG electroencephalography. You wear a cap with electrodes that press against your scalp. It's safe, it's easy, but the skull is a massive insulator. It smears the electrical signals. You can detect broad states like this person is focused or this person is imagining moving their right hand. But you aren't going to get the precision needed to type 60 words per minute or play a high-speed video game. For that, you need to be under the hood.
Which brings us to the history. This didn't start with Elon Musk and a sleek presentation in California. We've been poking at this for a long time. You mentioned the 70s earlier.
1973 is the big milestone. Jacques Vidal at UCLA coined the term brain-computer interface. He published a paper suggesting that observable EEG signals could be used as a communication channel. He actually demonstrated a basic BCI where a user could navigate a cursor through a maze using visual evoked potentials. It was incredibly primitive. Think of it as the Pong era of neurotech, but it proved the concept was physically possible.
It's wild to think that while people were wearing bell-bottoms and listening to Led Zeppelin, Vidal was already trying to merge man and machine. But things stayed pretty quiet on the human front for a while after that, didn't they?
The hardware just wasn't there. You needed the computing power to process those signals in real time, and you needed the materials science to create electrodes that didn't immediately cause a massive immune response. The next massive leap didn't happen until 1998. That's when Philip Kennedy implanted a glass and gold electrode into a man named Johnny Ray. Johnny had locked-in syndrome following a brainstem stroke. He was fully conscious but completely paralyzed.
I remember reading about that. Kennedy used a neurotrophic electrode, right? It actually encouraged the brain tissue to grow into the sensor.
Precisely. It was a bridge. It allowed Johnny Ray to move a computer cursor just by thinking about it. It was the first time an invasive implant gave a human being back a piece of their agency. Then, in 2004, the BrainGate consortium took it to the next level. They used the Utah array, which looks like a tiny bed of 100 silicon needles. They implanted it into Matthew Nagel, a young man with tetraplegia.
Matthew Nagel is a legend in this field. He was the first one to really show the world what was possible. He could control a computer, check his email, and even operate a television remote. And he did it with an array that was plugged into a pedestal on top of his head. It wasn't wireless or sleek. He was literally tethered to a rack of computers.
It was the mainframe era of BCIs. But the data Matthew provided was invaluable. It showed that the motor cortex, the part of the brain that plans movement, remains active and organized even years after a spinal cord injury. The brain is still broadcasting. The signal, there's just no receiver at the other end of the wire. BrainGate proved we could build that receiver.
So we have these decades of slow, steady academic progress. And then, around 2017, the private money starts pouring in. We get Neuralink, we get Synchron, we get Paradromics. Why the sudden rush? Is it just because the tech got better? Or is there a bigger market play here?
It's a combination. First, the miniaturization of electronics reached a point where you could fit the processing power of a 1970s supercomputer onto a chip the size of a coin. Second, we've had a revolution in machine learning. Decoding neural signals isn't like translating Spanish to English. It's more like trying to predict the weather by listening to the sound of the wind. You need sophisticated algorithms to filter out the noise and find the intent. And third, there's a massive medical need. Millions of people suffer from paralysis, ALS, or stroke. If you can prove a BCI works for them, the FDA path opens up and suddenly you have a viable business.
Let's talk about the current state of play. It's March 2026. If I'm a patient today with a severe spinal cord injury, what does the landscape look like? Because it feels like there's a massive battle between the invasive camp and the slightly less invasive camp.
That's the core tension right now. You have Neuralink on one side, led by their N1 implant. This is the high bandwidth approach. They use a literal robot. It looks like a giant sewing machine to stitch 64 incredibly thin, flexible threads into the motor cortex. Each thread has 16 electrodes. That's over 1,000 channels of data.
And they've moved past the monkey playing mind pong stage. We have real humans walking around with these now.
We do. Nolan Arbaugh was the first. He's been very public about his experience. As of early this year, they've expanded the trials to over 20 participants globally. What's fascinating about Nolan's case isn't just that he can move a cursor, it's the bandwidth of his life now. He's playing Civilization 6 for hours at a time. He's playing Mario Kart. He's browsing the web at speeds that rival someone using a physical mouse. The N1 is wireless, it charges inductively, and it's invisible under the skin. It's the closest we've come to a consumer-grade medical device.
But it still requires a craniotomy. You're still taking a piece of the skull out and letting a robot poke your brain. That's a high bar for a lot of people.
Which is why Synchron is such a formidable competitor. Their device is called the Stentrode, and it's a stroke of genius in terms of surgical access. They don't go through the skull at all. They go through the jugular vein. They snake a catheter up into the motor cortex, but they stay inside the blood vessels. The device expands like a stent against the walls of the vessel, where it can hear the neurons through the vein wall.
It's the outpatient BCI, or at least much closer to it. You don't need a neurosurgeon and a robotic sewing machine. You need an interventional radiologist.
Synchron got their FDA breakthrough device designation back in 2021, and they've been in pivotal trials ever since. The trade-off, of course, is bandwidth. Because they're inside a blood vessel, they can't get as close to the individual neurons as Neuralink can. They aren't getting 1,000 channels of high-fidelity data. They're getting enough to click, scroll, and type at a functional speed. For a patient with ALS who just wants to text their family or browse the news, that might be more than enough, especially if the surgery is significantly safer.
It's the good enough versus maximum performance debate. It's like choosing between a high-end gaming PC that requires a liquid nitrogen cooling system and a very reliable laptop. Most people probably just want the laptop.
For now, yes. But the performance side is where we see the really mind-blowing stuff. Look at the recent word from the BrainGate team in Stanford. Using these invasive arrays, they've demonstrated speech-to-text decoding at over 60 words per minute. They aren't just moving a cursor to point and click on a virtual keyboard. The algorithms are actually listening to the brain's attempt to move the muscles involved in speech, the jaw, the tongue, the larynx, and translating those phantom movements into text.
That's a huge distinction. It's not thinking the word apple. It's the brain trying to say the word apple, and the BCI intercepting the motor command.
Yes, decoding abstract thought is still extremely difficult. We don't really know where the concept of apple lives in a way that's consistent across different days, let alone different people. But we know exactly where the move my tongue to the roof of my mouth signal lives. By focusing on the motor cortex, we're tapping into the most organized and predictable part of the brain's output.
So we have these amazing success stories. We have Noland Arbaugh playing Civ 6. We have speech-to-text breakthroughs. Why isn't this everywhere? If I'm a billionaire who just wants to type faster, why can't I go get a Neuralink tomorrow?
Aside from the fact that elective brain surgery on healthy people is a bioethical nightmare, there are massive technical hurdles that the flashy demos don't always highlight. The biggest one is signal decay. The brain is an incredibly hostile environment for electronics. It's salty, it's wet, and it has an immune system that is very, very good at its job.
The gliosis problem.
Right. When you stick a probe into brain tissue, the brain reacts by trying to wall it off. Glial cells, the support cells of the brain, wrap around the electrodes, creating a layer of scar tissue. Over time, that tissue acts as an insulator. The signal gets quieter and quieter until, eventually, the device goes deaf. Most of the Utah arrays used in early trials only lasted 2 to 5 years before the signal quality dropped below a useful threshold.
That's a tough sell. We'll give you telepathy, but you have to have brain surgery every 4 years to replace the hardware.
It's the battery life problem of neurotech. Companies are working on stealth coatings, polymers that mimic the texture and chemistry of brain tissue to trick the immune system. Neuralink's flexible threads are part of the strategy. They're designed to move with the brain as it sloshes around in your skull rather than stabbing it like a rigid needle. But we don't have 10 years of human data on those threads yet. We're still in the wait-and-see phase for long-term stability.
And then there's the bandwidth bottleneck on the decoding side. Even if the hardware is perfect, we're still trying to interpret a very complex language with a very limited dictionary.
That's where the AI comes in. As Dr. Leigh Hochberg from BrainGate often says, the hardware is the prerequisite, but the software is the driver. We're getting much better at using neural networks to denoise the signals. But even then, there's the issue of neuroplasticity. Your brain is constantly rewiring itself. The way your neurons fire to move your hand today might be slightly different than how they fire 6 months from now. The BCI has to relearn you constantly. It's a dynamic, co-adaptive process. The user learns the BCI, and the BCI learns the user.
It's like a marriage, but with more electrodes. Now, let's pivot to the stuff that usually gets people's heart rates up, the ethics. This isn't just about moving a cursor. We're talking about a direct port into the human mind. If we're already worried about big tech tracking our clicks, what happens when they can track our pre-clicks?
Neural privacy is going to be the defining legal battle of the 2030s. Right now, if I think about something but don't say it or do it, that information stays private. It's the ultimate black box. But if I'm wearing a BCI that is constantly streaming my neural activity to a cloud-based AI for decoding, who owns that data? Does a company have the right to analyze my emotional state to show me better ads? Can the government subpoena my intent in a legal case?
You thought about speeding, so here's a ticket. That's a dark road.
And then there's the agency problem. As these decoding algorithms get smarter, they start to use predictive text, just like your phone does. If I start thinking a sentence and the BCI completes it for me, who is the author of that sentence? If the AI misinterprets my intent and sends a message I didn't mean to send, am I responsible for the consequences? We're blurring the line between biological intent and algorithmic execution.
It's the autocorrect of the soul. I can barely handle it when my phone changes ducking to something else. I don't want it doing that with my motor commands. But there's also the digital divide aspect. If this tech eventually moves beyond medical necessity and into augmentation, we're looking at a world where the wealthy can literally think faster and learn more efficiently than everyone else.
The neural elitism scenario. It's a valid concern. If a BCI can give you a 20% boost in cognitive processing or allow you to interface with an AI assistant at the speed of thought, that's a massive competitive advantage in the workplace. If that's only available to people who can afford a $50,000 elective surgery, you aren't just looking at an economic gap, you're looking at a biological gap.
It reminds me of that Beethoven effect we talked about. Episode 1330, for those who want a throwback. We discussed bone conduction and how Beethoven used a rod to hear his piano. That was a low-tech BCI, in a way. It was an augmentation for a disability. But once you have the tech, the line between restoration and enhancement gets very blurry, very quickly.
It's the LASIK model. LASIK started as a way to fix severe vision problems. Now, people with 20/20 vision get it to have supervision. I suspect BCIs will follow a similar path, but we are a long way from elective implants. The surgical risk, the infection risk, and the signal decay problem mean that for a healthy person, the cost-benefit analysis just doesn't make sense yet.
So, what's the realistic timeline? When does this go from miracle for the paralyzed to something I see at the Apple Store?
For medical applications, it's now. Over the next 5 years, 26 to 2030, we're going to see the first wave of FDA-approved commercial devices. You'll see them in specialized clinics. You'll see insurance companies starting to cover them for ALS or spinal cord injuries. It will become the standard of care for restoring communication.
And for the rest of us? The able-bodied folks who just hate typing on glass screens.
That's likely the 2030s, and it probably won't be invasive. I think we'll see a consumer BCI era driven by high-density non-invasive wearables. Maybe not EEG, but something like functional near-infrared spectroscopy, FNIRs, or even high-resolution ultrasound. These can see brain activity through the skull with much better resolution than EEG. If you can put that into a pair of glasses or a headband, and it lets you control your smart home or dictate an email at 80 words per minute without surgery, that's the mainstream tipping point.
I'm still holding out for the imaginary keyboard where I can just drum my fingers on a table and have it recognized. But the idea of just thinking it's seductive. It's also a little terrifying.
It's both. We are moving from the era of watching the brain to the era of talking to the brain, and as that conversation becomes more bidirectional, the stakes get higher. But for the people who have lost their voice or their ability to move, this isn't a scary future, it's a hopeful present.
That's a good way to frame it. The BrainGate isn't just a technical term, it's a literal description of what's happening. We're opening a gate that's been locked for a lot of people.
I think the takeaway for anyone listening, especially the developers and engineers out there, is that the low-hanging fruit isn't in the hardware, it's in the decoding. If you can build a better machine learning model that handles neural noise or adapts to plasticity, you are contributing just as much as the person designing the electrodes. And for the policymakers, the time to start thinking about neural data rights was yesterday. We need to treat brain data with more sensitivity than we treat DNA.
You can change your password, you can even change your name, but you can't change your neural signatures. Once that cat's out of the bag, it's out.
If people want to stay on top of this, I highly recommend following the work coming out of the Open BCI community. They're doing amazing things with open source hardware and software. It's a great way to get involved without needing a multi-billion-dollar lab. And of course, keep an eye on the clinical trial registries. That's where the real rubber meets the road. Data is being published.
Well, this has been a trip. From Bratislava basements to high-bandwidth motor cortex threads. I feel like I need a nap, but my BCI is probably telling my smart fridge to order more celery instead.
At least it's not ordering more stag weekends in Slovakia. I don't think my liver or my neural pathways could handle another Hilbert Flemingtop special.
Fair point. Speaking of Hilbert, thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flemingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Madal for providing the GPU credits that power this whole operation. It takes a lot of compute to turn donkey and sloth thoughts into a podcast.
It really does. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the gray matter, consider leaving us a review on your podcast app. It really helps the algorithms find us, though hopefully they don't start reading our minds just yet.
Find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the links to subscribe. We'll be back next time with whatever weirdness Daniel sends our way. Until then, keep your thoughts to yourself, unless you're plugged in.
Goodbye, everyone.
Take it easy. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text to speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show.